The first crack of knuckles against jawbone sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. It echoed down the main street of Ironwood Crossing, a sound so ugly it made the dust itself seem to settle in shame. Miriam tasted blood and dirt. Her vision swam, the faces of the townsfolk blurring into a cowardly watercolor of averted eyes and tight-lipped silence. Two baby girls, not even a day old, wailed from a wicker basket at her feet. Their cries were thin, reedy things, no match for the booming voice of the man standing over her. That man was Elias Lair, her brother-in-law. His face, usually just mean, was twisted into something truly monstrous. "You bring shame," he spat, his voice a low growl that promised more violence. "Two girls! What good are girls to the Lair name? You've cursed this family." He yanked her up by the arm, her worn dress tearing at the shoulder. The crowd flinched, but no one moved. No one spoke. They were all afraid of the Lairs. Elias and his older brother Randall owned half the town and held the other half in a grip of debt and fear. Miriam stumbled, trying to stay on her feet, her body still weak and broken from childbirth. All she wanted was to get to her babies, to shield them from this ugliness, from the hatred they were born into. "Please," she whispered, a prayer to a deaf town. "They're your brother's children. They're innocent." Across the street, a man stood in the long, dark shadow of the general store. He was built like the mountains he came from, broad, weathered, and silent. Scars crisscrossed his face, one pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent, grim line. His name was Ezekiel Brandt, and the town mostly left him alone. They called him the Mountain Man, a ghost who came down only for supplies and then vanished back into the pines. He watched the scene unfold, his hands calloused and thick, tightening on the leather strap of the rifle slung over his shoulder. He saw the townsfolk scurry away, saw the fear in their eyes, and something cold and hard settled in his gut. Elias raised his hand again. The second slap was louder than the first. It sent Miriam sprawling into the dust, her head cracking against the wooden porch of the saloon. The twins' cries escalated into terrified shrieks. That was the sound that broke the spell. Something shifted in Ezekiel's eyes. A flicker of an old fire, banked for years, suddenly roared back to life. He took one step, then another, his spurs ringing a death knell on the dusty street. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. Every deliberate step was a promise. The Lair brothers turned as he mounted the saloon steps, their sneers faltering at the sight of the mountain man's face. "Step aside, Brandt," Elias growled, trying to regain his footing. "This is family business." Ezekiel's voice, when it came, was low and steady, like distant thunder rolling down from the peaks. "I reckon it's everybody's business when a man strikes a woman in front of her crying babies." He moved between them and Miriam, a solid wall of muscle and quiet rage. His shadow fell over them, and for the first time, Elias and Randall looked uncertain. The crowd, sensing a shift in power, stopped scurrying. They watched, holding their breath. Ezekiel looked down at the two wailing infants, then at the broken woman in the dust. "These girls," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent street, "they need a father." He paused, letting the words hang in the thick, hot air. Then he looked directly at Elias, his eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with a long-buried past. "I will be their father now." The declaration was a stone thrown into a still, stagnant pond. The ripples of shock spread through the crowd. Elias's face went from red to purple with rage. But before he could spit out a reply, Ezekiel had already turned his back on them. It was the ultimate insult. With hands that were surprisingly gentle, he helped Miriam to her feet. Then, as if she weighed nothing, he lifted her into his arms. With a deft movement, he scooped up the basket containing the twins. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Ezekiel Brandt, the silent mountain man, carried his newfound family down the street. He didn't head for the doctor's office or the boarding house. He walked straight toward the whitewashed church at the end of the road, his stride steady and unbroken. Behind him, Elias's threats of lawyers and vengeance echoed off the storefronts, but they sounded hollow now, like the desperate howls of a wolf that has just met a grizzly bear. No one in that crowd understood what they had just witnessed. They thought they saw a good man standing up to bullies. They were wrong. They had just seen a ghost, a man thought long dead to the world, declare a war that had started 10 years ago and 1,000 miles away. And the Lair brothers had no idea the reckoning they had just called down upon themselves. Inside the church's dusty back room, the air smelled of old hymnals and beeswax. Ezekiel gently dabbed at Miriam's cut lip with a damp cloth. The twins, exhausted from their ordeal, were finally asleep in their basket, their tiny chests rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. "You didn't have to do that," Miriam murmured, her voice hoarse. "They'll come for you. You don't know what they're like." Ezekiel's hands didn't stop their steady, gentle work. "Oh, I think I do," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at the sleeping girls, and a flicker of something, pain, memory, rage, crossed his face before being locked away again. "Men like that," he said, "they're all the same. They feed on fear. The only thing they understand is a bigger fist." A soft knock on the door announced Preacher Carter, his kind face etched with worry. "The Lair brothers were just in my office," he said, closing the door quietly. "They're filing papers with Judge Morrison first thing in the morning. They're claiming your homestead reverts to the family, Miriam. They say since you had no male heir, the land is forfeit." Miriam's face, already pale, lost its last bit of color. But James, my husband, he had the deed drawn up special. It was for me and our children, not just sons." The preacher nodded grimly. "That may be, but the Lairs have the judge in their pocket. They'll argue a lone woman can't possibly work the land, that it's in the town's best interest for them to manage it." "She won't be alone," Ezekiel said. The words were flat, final. He stood up, and the small room seemed to shrink around him. "I meant what I said. I'm their father now. We'll fight this." Preacher Carter looked from Ezekiel's stony face to Miriam's frightened one. "Son, do you understand what you're taking on? The Lairs aren't just greedy. There's bad blood there. Old man Lair, their father, he died awful sudden right after signing that homestead over to your James." Miriam flinched. They whispered things, that James had poisoned him to get the land. It wasn't true. James loved his father. "Truth doesn't matter much to men like that," the preacher sighed. "They've been nursing that grudge for years. They see you and these girls as the final insult. This isn't just about land and water, son. This is about a blood feud." Ezekiel's expression didn't change, but a muscle jumped in his scarred jaw. "Blood feuds are messy," he said. "People get hurt." His eyes were distant, looking at something only he could see. "And I'm real tired of watching people get hurt." He turned to Miriam. "We can't stay here. They'll use the law to trap you. I have a place in the hills, a line shack. It's not much, but it's safe. It's defensible." Miriam looked at her sleeping babies, then at this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, like an avenging angel. Defensible? What were they getting into? Who was this man who spoke of fighting Lairs and defending cabins as if he were preparing for a siege? She had a terrifying thought that she hadn't been saved from a fight. She'd just been recruited into a war. And as Ezekiel began to pack their meager supplies, the deliberate, efficient way he moved reminded her not of a simple mountain man, but of a soldier getting ready for battle. The trail to Ezekiel's cabin wasn't a trail at all. It was a ghost path, a series of game trails and hidden clearings that only someone who knew the mountains intimately could navigate. The wagon creaked and groaned as he guided the horses through dense thickets of pine and aspen, the lights of Ironwood Crossing vanishing behind them like dying embers. Miriam huddled in the back, a baby tucked under each arm, the blankets wrapped tight against the rising chill. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. Stars glittered in the black sky, so close and bright they looked like chips of ice. When they finally arrived, the moon was high, casting a silver glow on a small, brutally simple cabin. It was built of thick, dark logs, chinked with mud and moss, and looked less like a home and more like a fortress. It was tucked into a narrow ravine, with a sheer rock face at its back and a clear field of fire in the front. A small, fast-moving creek burbled nearby. "It's not much," Ezekiel said, his voice low as he helped her down. "But no one's getting up here without me knowing about it." Inside, the cabin was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A narrow bed, a table, and 2 chairs were the only furniture. But what caught Miriam's eye were the details. The windows weren't just windows. They were reinforced with iron bars set deep into the logs. The heavy wooden door had not one, but 3 thick deadbolts. And hanging above the mantelpiece wasn't a decorative sampler, but a Sharps buffalo rifle, its long barrel gleaming in the firelight. This wasn't a hunter's cabin. This was a bolt hole. This was the home of a man expecting trouble. "Thank you," Miriam whispered, looking around the small, safe space. For the first time in days, she felt she could breathe. The next morning, the sun streamed through the barred windows. Ezekiel was already outside, the rhythmic thwack of an axe echoing through the clear mountain air. Miriam, still sore and moving slowly, laid the twins on a blanket by the fire. One of them, little Sarah, began to fuss. The swaddling had come loose. As Miriam fumbled with the blanket, Ezekiel stepped inside, his brow beaded with sweat. He stopped and watched her, a strange expression on his face. "You want to learn?" Miriam asked softly, sensing his curiosity. He hesitated, his large calloused hands looking clumsy and out of place next to the tiny infant. But he nodded and sat on the floor beside her. "Like this," Miriam demonstrated, her movements sure and practiced. "Fold the corner down. Keep it snug. They like to feel held tight." He watched her intently, then reached for the other twin, Hannah, who had started to stir. His first attempt was awkward, the blanket too loose. "A little tighter," Miriam coached, her hand gently guiding his. On the third try, he got it right. The baby settled instantly, her eyes drifting closed. A slow smile, the first she'd ever seen, spread across Ezekiel's scarred face. It transformed him, softening the hard lines and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. Later that day, he insisted they walk down to the spring that fed his creek. "You need to know the lay of the land," he said, his tone all business again. The spring was a crystal-clear pool bubbling up from a fissure in the rock. "This water," he said, staring into its depths, "it's not like the others in this valley." He scooped some up in his hands. "The Ute, the old ones, they called this place water that heals. Said it had minerals in it you couldn't find anywhere else." He let the water run through his fingers. "The Lairs don't just want your land for the grazing, Miriam, and they don't just want it to control the town's water supply." He looked up, his eyes hard as granite. "Randall Lair is a clever man. He's been in talks with the railroad. They're planning a spur line through here and a health spa for rich folks from back east. Your spring, Miriam, isn't just water. It's a gold mine. They're not just trying to take your home. They're trying to steal a fortune, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way." Miriam stared at him, her blood running cold. This was so much bigger than a family feud. It was about greed on a scale she couldn't comprehend. The pieces were falling into place. The rush to get her land, the violence, the utter disregard for the law. Her husband hadn't just left her a homestead. He had left her a treasure, and in doing so, he had painted a target on her back and on the backs of her 2 tiny, helpless daughters. The next few days passed in a tense quiet. Ezekiel worked relentlessly, strengthening the cabin, clearing brush from the perimeter, and setting what looked suspiciously like snares along the hidden paths. He taught Miriam how to load and fire the rifle, his hands guiding hers on the cold steel, his manner patient but firm. "Hope you never need it," he'd said, "but hope ain't a strategy." He seemed to be preparing for a siege, and Miriam found herself caught between terror and a strange sense of security. She was with a man who knew how to face monsters. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. It wasn't one of the Lairs. This man rode with an easy grace, his paint horse moving silently through the trees. Ezekiel saw him and relaxed, raising a hand in greeting. "Henry," he called out. The rider dismounted, a tall, lean man with sharp eyes and long, braided hair. He was Ute, dressed in a mix of buckskin and settler's clothing. "Henry Two Rivers," Ezekiel said by way of introduction. "We rode together, a long time ago." Henry's gaze took in Miriam, the twins, and the fortified cabin. He nodded slowly. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, old friend," he said, his voice quiet. His English was perfect, laced with a dry humor. They spoke for a long time, their voices low. Henry had been in town listening. "The Lairs have the judge," Henry confirmed, But that's not all. They produced a will. Old Man Lairs. They claim it says the homestead reverts to them if James died without a male heir. They say it supersedes the deed. Miriam's heart sank. A will? James had never mentioned a will. It's a forgery, she said, her voice shaking. I'm sure of it. Proving it's another matter, Henry said grimly. And they aren't just relying on paper. Randall has hired men, hard cases from the mining camps. They aren't deputies, Ezekiel. They're gunslingers. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken menace. They were trapped. The law was against them, and an army of hired guns was gathering in the valley below. Running was impossible. They would be hunted down. There's always a way, Ezekiel said, his eyes fixed on the map of the territory pinned to the wall. He stared at it for a long moment. Then a new light came into his eyes. The land office, he said, in Cedar Springs, not here, not in Morrison's territory. It's a 2-day ride, Henry warned, and they'll be watching the roads. We won't take the roads, Ezekiel said. He turned to Miriam. There's a secret I know about Judge Morrison, something from his past. I was hoping not to use it, but they've left me no choice. If I can't get to the deed, I'll get to the judge. Miriam looked at the hardness in his face, the cold certainty in his eyes. What kind of secret could a mountain man have on a territorial judge? The more she learned about Ezekiel Brandt, the less she understood. He was a man of contradictions, a gentle touch with a baby, a killer's eye, a soldier's discipline, and a network of secrets that ran deeper than any spring. She was putting her life and her daughter's lives in his hands, and she didn't even know who he truly was. But as he and Henry prepared to ride out at dawn, she knew one thing for sure. She had no other choice. The journey to Cedar Springs was a tense, silent ride through a landscape that seemed to hold its breath. Ezekiel and Henry moved like ghosts, using ravines and creek beds for cover, their horses picking their way over rock falls and through dense, thorny brush. They spoke little, communicating mostly through hand signals and shared glances. It was the easy language of men who had faced death together before. Miriam, left alone in the fortified cabin, felt every tick of the clock like a hammer blow. She sat with the rifle across her lap, starting at every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind. She was a mother protecting her young, and it filled her with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. Meanwhile, in Cedar Springs, Ezekiel and Henry didn't go to the land office first. They went to a small, dusty saloon on the edge of town. Ezekiel walked straight to a man playing poker in the back, a man with a tin star pinned to his vest. The man looked up, saw Ezekiel, and his face went white. "Brandt," he breathed. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet, Miller," Ezekiel said, his voice low. "I need a favor." An hour later, they walked into the territorial land office. The clerk was a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers. When Ezekiel asked for the records on the Lair homestead, the clerk began to sweat. That's a lot of files to go through," he stammered. "Could take days." Ezekiel leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "We don't have days. Find it." The clerk scurried into the back. They could hear the sound of drawers opening and closing, of papers rustling frantically. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the clerk returned, his face pale. He was holding a single folded document. "Here it is," he whispered, placing it on the counter as if it were a venomous snake. "The original deed." Ezekiel unfolded it. There it was, James Lair's signature, clear and strong. And right next to it, Miriam Lair's. Joint owners. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was on the back. Sketched in what looked like berry juice was a small, crude map. It showed the spring, and next to it, a series of symbols. Henry leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "I know these marks," he said softly. "My grandfather drew them in the dirt for me when I was a boy." He looked at Ezekiel, his expression grave. "This map doesn't lead to gold, my friend. It leads to the burial site of a Ute shaman, a holy place. It's right on the edge of your property, Miriam." The clerk, who had been listening, gasped. "Desecrating an Indian burial site is a federal crime," he whispered. "The army would get involved." Ezekiel stared at the map, a slow, cold smile touching his lips. James Lair. The quiet, gentle man had been shrewder than anyone knew. He hadn't just legally protected his wife, he had set a trap. A poison pill. The Lairs couldn't build their fancy spa or sell the water to the railroad without digging up a sacred grave, an act that would bring the full wrath of the Ute Nation and the United States Army down on their heads. They had the true deed, and now they had a weapon. Just as Ezekiel was about to ask for a copy, the telegraph office next door began to chatter. The clerk's eyes widened in terror. "They know you're here," he hissed. "Randall Lair has spies everywhere." Ezekiel grabbed the deed. "Copy it, now!" The clerk's hands shook as he transcribed the document. Outside, Ezekiel could see two rough-looking men step out of the telegraph office and start walking their way. They were out of time. The clerk shoved the copy into Ezekiel's hand. "Good luck," he breathed. "You'll need it." Ezekiel and Henry walked out of the land office, not looking at the approaching men. They walked calmly to their horses, untied them, and mounted. The two men blocked their path. "Mr. Lair would like a word," one of them said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Ezekiel looked down at him from his horse, his face unreadable. "Tell him I'm busy." Then in a movement so fast it was a blur, he spurred his horse directly at the man, who jumped back with a yelp. Henry followed and they galloped out of town, leaving the hired guns standing in a cloud of dust. They had won the battle for the deed, but the Lairs now knew exactly what they had. The ride back to the cabin wouldn't be a quiet one. It would be a race. A race against greed, against corruption, and against the desperate, violent men who were now hunting them. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits, taking a different, more dangerous route back. They knew the main trails would be watched. Henry led them through the Badlands, a maze of canyons and sheer rock faces, where one wrong step meant a fatal fall. The air was thick with the knowledge that they were being hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a rifleman. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of their pursuers. They finally reached the ridge above the cabin just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. The cabin was dark, silent, too silent. Ezekiel dismounted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay here," he whispered to Henry. He moved down the slope like a predator, using the trees and rocks for cover, his eyes scanning every inch of the clearing. The front door was slightly ajar. A cold dread gripped him. He crept to the side of the cabin, peering through the barred window. The fire was dead. The room was empty. The cradle was overturned. Miriam and the twins were gone. For a moment, Ezekiel's blood ran cold. He thought he had failed again, just like he had failed his own family years ago. Rage, black and absolute, washed over him. He kicked the door open, his rifle at the ready, his mind already calculating angles, preparing to kill. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture was smashed. Supplies were strewn across the floor. It was the scene of a violent struggle. Then he saw it. On the floor, near the hearth, was a single feather, a blue jay's feather, tucked into a small knot of cloth. It was a signal, a sign he and Henry had used in the old days. It meant, "I am safe, but I am a prisoner. Follow." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. Miriam was smart. She was a survivor. She had left him a trail. Henry appeared at the doorway, his face a grim mask. Ezekiel showed him the feather. "They have her," Ezekiel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They took her to force our hand." "Where?" Henry asked. Ezekiel's eyes went to the window, looking down the mountain toward Ironwood Crossing. "There's only one place they'd be arrogant enough to hold her," he said. "They took her back to her own homestead. They're occupying it, daring us to come down from the mountain." The trap was set. The Lairs had the location, the numbers, and the hostage. They thought they held all the cards, but they didn't know about the map on the back of the deed, and they didn't know what Ezekiel Brandt was willing to do to get his family back. The mountain man was gone. In his place was the man he used to be, a soldier, a hunter of men. And he was about to bring a war down into the valley that would burn the Lair family to the ground. Darkness fell like a shroud over the mountains. A cold wind moaned through the pines. Inside the ruined cabin, Ezekiel and Henry made their plans. There was no talk of surrender, no talk of negotiation. Their conversation was short, brutal, and to the point. It was the talk of soldiers before a battle. "They'll have watchers on the main trail," Henry said, tracing a line in the dirt on the floor. "At least 4 men." Ezekiel nodded, cleaning his rifle with quick, efficient movements. "So we don't use the trail. We go over the top. The Whisper Ridge. Can you still make that climb in the dark?" Henry looked at him, a faint smile on his lips. "Can you?" They moved out an hour after midnight, two ghosts melting into the moonless night. The climb up Whisper Ridge was treacherous, a near vertical ascent over loose rock and thorny brush. They moved with a silent, coordinated grace, their years of shared experience creating an unspoken language between them. At the summit, they looked down on the valley. A single light burned in the window of Miriam's homestead. They descended the other side, using the cover of a dry creek bed to approach the house from the rear, from the one direction the Lairs wouldn't expect. The homestead was surrounded by hired guns. 2 men on the porch, one by the barn, another circling the perimeter. They were confident, relaxed, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. They were about to get a very nasty surprise. Henry faded into the shadows near the barn, a knife in his hand. Ezekiel crept toward the back of the house. He could hear voices from inside. Randall Lair's voice, smooth and condescending, and Miriam's, defiant and strong. "You can't win," Randall was saying. "Sign the land over, and I'll let you and your brats leave this valley with your lives." "Never," Miriam said, her voice ringing with a courage that made Ezekiel's heart swell. A sharp, sudden cry from the barn, cut off just as quickly, told Ezekiel that Henry had done his work. One down. Ezekiel moved to the back window. Elias Lair was inside, along with Randall and 2 of the hired guns. Miriam was tied to a chair, the twins in their basket at her feet. Elias was pacing, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. "Let's just get rid of her," he snarled. "Make it look like an accident." "Patience, brother," Randall said coolly. "Brant will come for her, and when he does, we'll end this for good." That was Ezekiel's cue. He kicked the back door off its hinges, the sound exploding like a cannon shot in the quiet night. He was a whirlwind of motion, a specter of violence. Before the 2 hired guns could even turn, he had shot one and disabled the other with the butt of his rifle. Elias, his face a mask of shock and terror, fumbled for his pistol. Ezekiel was on him in 2 strides, disarming him with a brutal efficiency that broke 2 of his fingers. Elias screamed. Randall, ever the cool one, didn't panic. He grabbed the basket with the twins, holding it up as a shield. "One more step, Brant," he hissed, "and the brats die." The cabin was a frozen tableau. Miriam straining against her ropes. Elias, whimpering on the floor. Randall, his face a sneer of triumph, holding the 2 infants hostage. And Ezekiel, his face a thundercloud of fury, his rifle leveled at Randall's chest. "You think I won't do it?" Randall taunted. "They mean nothing to me." "They mean everything to me," Ezekiel said, his voice a low growl. "But you made one mistake. You assumed I came alone." Just then, the front door swung open. Henry 2 Rivers stood there, silent as the grave, his rifle aimed directly at Randall's head. The tables had turned. Randall's sneer faltered. He was trapped. He looked from Ezekiel to Henry, his calculating mind racing, looking for an out. There was none. It was over. But desperate men do desperate things. And Randall Lair was more desperate than he had ever been in his life. "Put the basket down, Randall." Ezekiel's voice was deceptively calm, a quiet warning before a lightning strike. Randall's eyes darted between Ezekiel and Henry. The triumph had vanished from his face, replaced by the cornered rat look of a man who knows he's out of moves. "This isn't over, Brant," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He slowly lowered the basket to the floor. "Now untie her," Ezekiel commanded. Randall shot a venomous glare at Elias, who was still cradling his broken fingers on the floor. "Get up, you useless sot, and cut her loose." Elias scrambled to his feet and, with his good hand, sawed at Miriam's ropes with a knife. The moment she was free, Miriam lunged for the basket, scooping her daughters into her arms, her body shielding them protectively. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Sirens were wailing in the distance. The shots had been heard in town. Preacher Carter would have already sent for the marshal. The Lairs' little kingdom was crumbling around them, and that's when it happened. Randall, seeing his empire of greed and fear collapsing, made a final, desperate play. With a roar of fury, he lunged not at Ezekiel, but at the heavy oil lamp on the table. He hurled it against the far wall. The glass shattered, and flames exploded across the dry wooden planks. The room was instantly filled with smoke and fire. "If I can't have this land," Randall screamed, his face illuminated by the growing inferno, "no one will!" Ezekiel didn't hesitate. "Henry, get them out!" he yelled, shoving Miriam and the babies toward the door where Henry was waiting. Amid the chaos, Elias, blinded by smoke and panic, stumbled toward the wrong door and ran straight into a wall of fire. His screams were horrifyingly brief. Ezekiel turned back to face Randall, who was now framed by the flames like a demon in hell. Randall pulled a derringer from his boot, a last-ditch effort. But Ezekiel was faster. He didn't shoot. He closed the distance and his fist connected with Randall's jaw in a blow that lifted the bigger man off his feet. Randall Lair crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The fire was roaring now, consuming the house with an incredible speed. The roof groaned, ready to collapse. Ezekiel grabbed the front of Randall's shirt and began to drag him toward the door, the heat searing his skin, smoke choking his lungs. He wasn't going to let him die here. That would be too easy. Death wasn't the justice Randall Lair deserved. A prison cell was. He stumbled out onto the porch, dragging Randall behind him, just as the roof caved in with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the night sky. He collapsed onto the grass, coughing, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. Miriam was there, her face smudged with soot, the babies safe in her arms. Henry stood guard, his rifle still at the ready. The homestead was an inferno, a funeral pyre for the Lair's greed. Down the road, the lights of a dozen wagons and riders were approaching. The whole town was coming. They would find Miriam, her children, and her protectors safe. They would find the hired guns tied up by the barn, one Lair brother dead in the fire, and the other unconscious and waiting for a hangman's rope or a federal prison. The battle for the spring was over. The war for Ironwood Crossing was won. But as Ezekiel looked at Miriam and the two infant girls who had become his reason for living, he knew the biggest challenge was still ahead. Building a life, building a family, healing the wounds, both his and theirs, that the Lairs had inflicted. The fire burned brightly, cleansing the land of its tainted past, and in the warm glow, a new future was beginning to take shape. The aftermath of that fiery night settled over Ironwood Crossing like a slow, cleansing rain. With the Lair brothers gone, one dead, one in federal custody awaiting trial for a list of crimes that grew longer by the day, the town seemed to take its first deep breath in years. The fear that had choked them for so long was finally gone, replaced by a shame-faced sense of gratitude. The people who had once shunned Miriam now came to her in droves, offering food, supplies, and help. Under Ezekiel's quiet direction, a new house began to rise from the ashes of the old one, built by the hands of the very community that had once stood by and watched her suffer. Morgan the blacksmith, Patterson from the general store, ranchers and farmers who had all felt the Lair's boot on their necks, they all came to help rebuild. It wasn't just a house they were building, it was an apology. Henry Two Rivers stayed for a few weeks, his quiet presence a comfort. He helped Ezekiel lay the foundation of the new home, and in the evenings he would sit on the porch, telling old Ute stories to the twin girls who would coo and gurgle in his arms. One evening, he handed Ezekiel a packet of official-looking papers. "From the judge in Cedar Spring," he said, "the adoption. It's all legal and proper now. They're yours, my friend, in the eyes of the law as well as the heart." Ezekiel took the papers, his hands trembling slightly. Father. It was a title he never thought he would hold again. He looked at the two girls, Sarah and Hannah, sleeping peacefully in their new, hand-carved cradle. His daughters. The thought filled a hole in his soul he thought would be empty forever. Life settled into a new rhythm. The spring, once a source of conflict, now provided for the whole town, its clean, healing water a symbol of their renewal. Miriam, seeing the need, started a small school in her front room for the homesteaders' children, her gentle voice filling the house with the sounds of learning and laughter. She had found her purpose, not as a victim, but as a pillar of the new community they were all building together. Ezekiel found his place too. He was no longer the ghost of the mountain. He was a father, a builder, a protector. The hard lines on his face softened, and the smile he had first shown Miriam the day he learned to swaddle a baby became a more frequent visitor. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined him. One evening, as the autumn sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the valley, Ezekiel and Miriam sat together on their new porch. The twins were asleep inside. The sound of children's laughter had faded with the daylight, replaced by the gentle chirp of crickets. "I've been thinking about that first day," Ezekiel said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "In town, when I said I'd be their father." He turned to her, his eyes clear and full of a feeling he had kept locked away for a decade. "I told myself I was doing it for them, for justice. But that was only half the truth, Miriam." He took a deep breath. "The other half is, I think I was doing it for me. I was so lost up on that mountain, so empty. You and those girls, you saved me. You brought me back to life." Miriam's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in hers. "We saved each other, Ezekiel." He looked at their joined hands, then into her eyes. "Miriam," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "the adoption papers make me their father, but I want to be more. I want to be your husband. I want to build this life with you, for real, all of it." The crickets fell silent, as if holding their breath. Miriam's smile widened, tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't have to say anything. Her answer was in her eyes, in the way she squeezed his hand, in the simple, beautiful truth that had grown between them. Family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you build, the one you fight for, the one you choose. And in that quiet, golden twilight, under the vast western sky, two broken souls brought together by violence and hatred chose to become whole again, together. Stories like this remind us that even in the darkest of times, courage can light a fire that cleanses the world. They show us that the strength to stand up for what's right often comes from the most unexpected places. If you felt that spark of inspiration today, if you believe in the power of courage and compassion, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You never know when the next story might be the one you need to hear. Thanks for stopping by.